Related to our mission of supporting and fostering learning through the generation and sharing of knowledge, ACPA acknowledges the painful history of genocide in the United States for Native, Aboriginal, and Indigenous people. We honor and respect the many and diverse tribal nations and people who were forcibly removed from, as well as those still connected to this land. We particularly acknowledge and recognize that the land upon which our international headquarters is located today has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst a number of Indigenous people, including the Akahannock, Pocomoke, Piscataway, Anacostank, Mattapaniant, Nagameg, Pamunkey, Tawihent, Nanticoke, Chickahominy, Monacan, Mattapony, and Assateague tribal nations as the original occupants of the Washington, D.C. region. The ACPA Generativity Project is a current and long-term initiative with the purpose of documenting the voices and perspectives of higher education today, built upon the past and actively pointing toward our future. In this project, we seek to capture the legacies and leading voices and experiences of trailblazers in our field. During a 1982 dinner in Washington, D.C., discussing ideas to advance the student affairs field, L. Lee Neffelkamp, a leading scholar and speaker of the student development movement, shared a vision for capturing the wisdom and experiences of elders with then ACPA President-elect Susan Comavez. 1982 to 1983 ACPA President Comavez took this idea to the ACPA Executive Council in the form of a proposal to create the Generativity Project. During Dr. Comavez's presidency, she announced the creation of the Generativity Project to devise and widely share student development theories via media technology. The project evolved after that to include living histories and other professional development material. Beverly Gelwick was the first chair of the Generativity Project Committee from 1982 to 1984. Legendary ACPA leaders Layla Moore, Susan Comavez, and Dennis C. Roberts followed in future years as chairpersons and leaders of this important work. A full history of key dates, influencers, and actions related to the Generativity Project is provided at the conclusion of this video. As we approach ACPA's 100th anniversary in 2024, ACPA continues the work inspired by Neffelkamp, initiated by Comavez, and actualized by Gelwick, Moore, and Roberts, to capture and share the association's and student affairs profession's history from a number of perspectives. ACPA has made these historic videos available to members online through the ACPA member portal. Just click the Resources tab. ACPA extends gratitude to Dr. Denny Roberts and Dr. Susan Comavez for their recent efforts to recreate the important history of the Generativity Project. ACPA acknowledges that this video has been produced and distributed through technology that may not be readily accessible to all members. Often referred to as the digital divide, we acknowledge that ready access to employment or wealth that provides computers, internet, or other technologies is not available to everyone who may benefit from the wisdom and information shared in this video project. Upon request, we are willing to provide a written transcript of this video interview. Please email info@acpa.nche.edu. Thank you to the featured panelists in this Generativity Project video, recorded on November 22, 2019, including Pat Kearney, 1988-1989 ACPA President, Nancy Evans, 2001 to 2002 ACPA President, Patty Perillo, 2008 to 2009 ACPA President, Nancy Schlossberg, first woman executive at the American Council on Education, and Vernon 2020-2021 ACPA President.
Thanks. I just want to thank everyone for giving their time. We've got some great folks here, and I'm just going to start off with just having our panelists just introduce themselves and just talk a little bit about their context of in terms of ACPA and higher education in general. So let's start off with Pat Kearney. Pat, welcome.
Thank you. Well, I kind of started out by having a dean ask me what I was going to do with my life after I finished an undergraduate degree in psychology, which is hard to go directly somewhere. And that got me interested in this field, and I went to Indiana for my master's. I got involved with ACPA probably how a lot of very young people do. They told me to go there to look for a job. But after having done that, I looked around and I went to a commission meeting. And they were so incredibly welcoming to somebody who is an introvert, believe it or not. And I kind of worked my way up from there. I got involved in the committees. I got involved as the chair of the commission, and then I eventually became president-elect of the organization. And it really was kind of central in my life. I think all of us find at times that our campus doesn't always give us everything we need, either emotionally or professionally. And at times like that, ACPA filled in that gap. And so I'm very grateful for the organization and glad I can contribute.
Nancy Schlossberg.
I had graduated from college and I was living in Pittsburgh and working as a secretary to Lucille Allen. And my husband and I were moving to back to New York, and Lucille said, well, you really should get to know Esther Lloyd Jones. In the meantime, I got a job in New York as the director of admissions of the Toby Coburn School for Fashion Careers. And I found that Julia Coburn said to me, Nancy, you're the best director of admissions we've ever had. However, our enrollment is going down. Well, the reason it was going down is that I was listening to the applicants and thinking about what was best for them instead of what was best for the school. So I thought, I better take a course in interviewing. So I got in touch with Esther, mentioning Lucille Allen. I enrolled in a class with Esther, and that was the beginning. I stayed on at Teachers College, got my doctorate, and then after that, through Esther, who was on the board at Pratt Institute, I became, I forget the title, but it was like a dean of freshmen at Pratt Institute. So that's how I got into the whole student life, student personnel, how I got into the field.
Thanks, Nancy. Patty Perillo, welcome.
Thank you. It is an honor to be amongst these incredible colleagues. So thank you for the invitation. I'm a first-generation college student, and I'm one of 8 children. My father was the youngest of 15. I have 80 first cousins, and I'm the first in my family to go to college. And while I was an undergrad, I struggled a lot. I really missed home. So developmentally, it was really difficult for me. I certainly wasn't aware of that it was a developmental challenge at the time. It's just, retrospectively, I realized it was difficult for me. And I struggled to find my way. And there were folks like my RA and a housekeeping staff member that just paid attention to my struggle and continued to bring me in and helped me stay the course. I was wanting to develop my own independence financially and took a semester off of college. And when I came back, I looked for a part-time job and found a part-time job in the career planning and placement office at that time. And while I was there, I realized that everybody in that profession had gone to get their master's degree in student affairs. And what I knew for sure as a first-generation college student was that I wanted to work in education because I knew education had transformative possibility. I witnessed it in my own life, and I knew I wanted to do it, but I wasn't sure how I was going to do it. And so when I spent time with my colleagues in the University of Delaware in the career planning and placement office, I realized that I could go on and get my master's degree, which I did, and decided to work a couple of years after that, really focusing on counseling. So I was a therapist in a counseling center in upstate New York, SUNY Plattsburgh, and really thought that I'd go on to get my PhD in counseling psychology, but realized my work in housing and residence life really energized me. And my work in counseling, while I was really good at it, didn't energize me as much. And so I realized I didn't want to be a counseling psychologist and was trying to figure out what was next, and went back to a dear mentor at the Career Planning and Placement Office, and she helped me realize that it was about staying in higher education and really thinking about the health and well-being of community. And so I stayed the course and went on to the University of Maryland to get my doctorate. And I've now worked at 7 institutions of higher learning in many different ways. But I went to ACPA initially, Pat, just like you did, to look for a job. That was the, and I loved it. I loved the people. I loved what I was learning. And I I would just go to convention every year, but it was when I was writing my doctorate where I was looking at the impact of alcohol use on the learning environment. I decided to join the commission, it was called Commission 18 then, now called the Commission on Alcohol and Other Drugs. And that was really my entree into ACPA in a variety of ways, but that's how it all started.
Nancy Evans, welcome.
Hello, thank you. It's really, as Patty said, it's an honor to be part of this panel of people that I so admire. So let's see. I also, like Patty, was a first generation college student. And I also was a student who had a disability, and this was a time before APA, ADA rather. So they encouraged me to go to college, they being vocational rehab in New York State. They encouraged me to go to college, but they did not encourage me to be what I wanted to be, which was a teacher, because they didn't think I could handle it physically. Well, you know, that was a long time ago. Anyway, I ended up going to college at SUNY Potsdam because they were nice to me. They were very accommodating and helpful and wanted me there, unlike other colleges that I had looked at. And it turned out to be a wonderful experience for me there. And I graduated with a degree in sociology and no idea what I was going to do. And ended up, as Patty did, talking to the dean of students about how he got to be what he was. And so he told me about the field of student affairs, and I got interested and applied and ended up at Southern Illinois University for my master's. Worked a few years in the field in residence life, student activities, and then decided I really needed a doctorate. And unlike Patty, nobody told me that counseling and student affairs were different. So I did get my doctorate in counseling psychology, but I had the good fortune of working, my doctoral advisor being Dick Capel, who was very much a student affairs person and very active in ACPA. And he's the one that really connected me into ACPA. And I went because he told me it would be a good experience for me and I should do a program. So I said, yes, sir. And I did my program and I learned about ACPA, and it truly was a great fit for me with welcoming people. And Commission 12, which is professional preparation, was where I ended up finding my home. So as chair of Commission 12 for a while. I also have been chair of Media Board, which is some different title now, I can't remember. And ended up being president of ACPA in 2001 to 2002. So that's my background and connection with ACPA.
Thank you all. What's so amazing is just your connections with ACPA and higher education in general, and the influence that you've had in shaping policy and in higher education and ACPA. And the theme of this conversation is around leading organizations during times of change and transition. And so we thought you would be the great folks to talk about this. And so maybe just for a little bit, if you could describe maybe, what were some pressing issues that were around during the time when you were the most involved with ACPA? So what are some things that you were grappling with, thinking about in terms of issues in higher education and ACPA during the time that you were involved? So Patty, you want to go first?
Sure. Before I became president of ACPA, I had led a group of colleagues thinking about a different organizational structure for the governing board of ACPA, because it was a really large board and we weren't able to make decisions as efficiently and as effectively because of the number of folks on the board. And so I worked on that task force. Ultimately, the association recommended the changes, and then I stepped into the presidency to really help implement the structure. And so ACPA was going through a new organization structure when I was the ACPA president. We also just launched a strategic plan for the association. And Vernon, you're going to be doing that in your presidency too. So I see that connection as well. So we were just launching a new strategic plan. There was also the precipice and beginning conversations of larger conversations around the possibility of consolidation with NASPA. And so those things were happening in ACPA while I was the president. What was also happening nationally internationally was the recession. So it was the front end of the recession. So I was president in 2008, 2009. And so the conversations around higher ed's accessibility and affordability were really preeminent and really at the fore, and had lots of conversations during the presidency about the cost of attending college. We were getting more non-traditional students attending college, and just thinking about affordability and access. That was an issue in higher ed in general. It was also at the time when MOOCs and online platforms were born, which really had higher ed and student affairs thinking a bit more about teaching and learning and how that happens and what that looks like on college campuses. And the third thing that I would say that was happening at the time nationally, and it's interesting to me that today is my last day as Vice President for Student Affairs at Virginia Tech. So I'm sitting in my office the last day here, heading to the University of Maryland, where I will be the Vice President for Student Affairs there starting in January. But what happened was the year prior to my becoming president of ACPA was when the massacre happened at Virginia Tech. And while I wasn't here at the time, I was working in higher education, and issues of emergency management, safety, and security were at the fore of everyone's mind. So they are some of the issues that we were considering in terms of higher education and some of the change management and transition management that I was leading people through.
I'd like to talk a little bit about how different my career path has been. I started out very involved in the American Counseling Association, and then over time worked at a number of universities, Howard University, Wayne State, and before going to Maryland, I was and this is part of his history, I was appointed as the first woman executive of the American Council on Education. So what was happening then, this is back in 1970, in the early 70s. And my portfolio was to get women to move into college presidencies, not just to get the women, but to get the institutions to be receptive to women as college presidents. And so that was part of the era of women moving into things. Before that, however, when I had been at Pratt Institute, that was back in 1961, feminism was an important issue. And I'm going to tell you one story. I decided that as Dean of Freshmen, that I would have an educational program on the role of women in higher education. A boring title, but that's what I came up with. And Sybil Moholy-Nagy, a famous woman, an architect, married to the famous Moholy-Nagy in Europe, was on the faculty of Pratt. So this is my entrance into Pratt. I invited her to give a speech on the role of women. I invited the wife of the college president, all the faculty. This was my big opening event. She gets up, you won't believe this, and she said, Dr. Cohn, my name was Dr. Schlossberg, has invited me to speak on the role of women in higher education, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to speak about the joys of uncommitted love. I thought I would die right then. The joys of uncommitted love, and I'm trying to impress the faculty, and this is 1961. I almost collapsed, but she went on talking, and I am absolutely dying. However, I will tell you that she changed my life. Not that I believe in uncommitted love, but she told a story of her life. And she said all of the women around her were housewives, and she was too, and they had a big salon. But she knew that she could take 10 minutes every morning to go to the bathroom. So she had a pad of paper in the bathroom, and she would write. And she said, at the end of 5 years, I had a book. And at this point, I'm married, I have 2 little children, and I remembered that. I don't need a whole lot of time. I just need a little time every morning to do what I have to do to keep my writing up. So I didn't learn about the joys of uncommitted love, but I did learn how to function as a woman who was a working mother, and that was rare. I didn't know many women. I knew many women who went in and out of the labor market, but I worked straight through.
Great story.
That's a great story. Oh my God.
Absolutely.
Pat, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think the thing that comes to mind was when I was president, and that was 30 plus years ago. I was working in California, and institutions of higher education were growing really quickly. But in California, it was growing with enormous diversity. And I'm not just talking about African American and white, I'm talking about Japanese and Chinese and Vietnamese and Central American and Mexican. And so for me, where ACPA should be moving, I thought, was to acknowledge that a lot of our research and programs really didn't make the assumptions that I needed to deal with as a professional every day of my life. So I had a title for my conference, which was called Vision and Will. And the reason that I had picked that, usually titles were very long academic kind of things, is on the assumption that we didn't know everything, but we knew a lot, and we should be trying to apply it to this newer, diverse community by going out, and of course, and talking with them and doing that. I interestingly enough, got a lot of criticism that it wasn't academic enough, and that we really couldn't do things because we didn't have all of the research that we needed. And I think I moved the needle a little bit. We all have to continue to move that needle. And the second thing that I remember us working on was trying to help move student affairs a little toward being part of undergraduate education and integrating more. There were very serious silos developing on a lot of campuses with student affairs people who thought that what they wanted to do was the most important thing in the world, which I happen to agree on. The difference is it isn't the only thing in the world, and students are there to get an education, and faculty can be important in their life. So those are the two things that I remember both losing some sleep over and maybe moving the needle just a little bit.
Nancy Evans.
Yeah, I actually had a very hard time with this question. I guess I don't have very good memory of, like I live in the moment or something, but as I think about my time as ACPA president, a couple things come to mind. actually staring at the conference program that is framed and was given to me after the conference. And my conference theme was Visions of Wisdom, Stories of Inclusion, Practice, and Scholarship. And as I think back to that time, I really saw two areas that I felt that ACPA was not paying enough attention to. One was inclusion, and I think that's a theme that, you know, Pat, you talked about that. I think that's a theme throughout, and it's really, really wonderful to see the association now taking that by its horns and saying, this is our mission. And so I really wanted to expand the attention that ACPA was playing to diverse groups, and that included more than racial and ethnic groups, but really looking at LGBT students, looking at students with disability, looking at older students that would make up the population of our college campuses, was making that up and would continue to in greater numbers. So that was really important to me. We weren't anywhere near talking about intersectionality and all the stuff that we're doing now, but it was where we were. And the second was scholarship. I really felt like the association had kind of downplayed its role in scholarship at that point in time. We really weren't doing very much. We really weren't using scholarship, say, as a basis of our programming and things like that. And I felt as a faculty member that that was an important role that I could play, was to emphasize more our scholarship and what we were doing and what we needed to be doing. The other major thing that was going on during that time was some issues around working with the central office. And that revolved around having, I think, too small a central office, and the central office not being very effective in carrying out the what the membership needed it to be doing. So there were a lot of discussions around that during my time. So I think that's what I have to offer on that.
Can I add something?
Yes.
To the mix?
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Because Esther is such a figure, I think it's important to tell you the story about her. I was at Pratt Institute, and the issue really that I was concerned with early on was bias. And with Lillian Troll, we did one of the first studies in counselor bias about adult learners. So I was very interested in that. But one day, Esther called me at Pratt and said, Nancy, the board, I don't know if they were the board of governors or whatever they were, Nancy, we don't like the way the students are dressing when they go for off-campus housing. They look horrible, and well, she didn't use the word horrible, but you need to get them to dress properly. So this young man comes into my office, and he looks like a freak, and I say, could you sit down? And I explained that we're trying to get students, when they go for off-campus housing, to dress more appropriately. He looks at me and he said, let me tell you something. You're a good-looking woman. You have good legs, but you dress. You're so dowdy the way you dress. If we're going to talk about how to dress, let's look at you. Well, my secretary literally fell off her chair. She got so hysterical. And he's telling me how I should dress. And then he said, and furthermore, I had the cover on Harper's Bazaar last month, so I know something about fashion. I called Esther after that and I said, you can assign that job to someone else because I can't do it anymore. But in the meantime, I did go out and I got some new clothes. But so that's another Esther story.
I love it. I love it. So, well, that makes me think about, so, you know, you are also inspirational. And that's what that's the joy I'm getting out of this conversation. And like, so, but for me is like, when there are challenging situations, where do you draw your inspiration from? You know, if there have been challenging times throughout your career, where have you drawn that inspiration to continue and to be involved and to be engaged with students and with others and with faculty and staff? Love to hear from Pat. Why don't you go first?
Which Pat? Me, okay. Well, of course, from my partner, that's very, very important. It's nice to come home and be able to debrief, but also from colleagues, and particularly from colleagues that maybe aren't at the same institutions. You might have worked with them and been very close with them at a time, and you trust them, and you can feel like you can talk with them about really, really difficult things, and that's not going to come back on your own campus to haunt you at all. And sometimes, they'll offer you some good ideas, and sometimes I found just talking it out gets your head going so that you can figure out what it is to do. And of course, I think the third thing, as I had mentioned before, was ACPA, that you can get professional and emotional support from ACPA colleagues that sometimes you can't get right on your own campus. So those are the ways that I handled it.
What about you, Nancy Evans?
I think for me, I look at past experiences that I have dealt with that have been challenging, and how did I get through that one, and try to use some of the things that I have learned earlier in my life to deal with current situations. I'm very introverted, as Pat mentioned she was. So if I talk with people, and I do, it's usually one or two very trusted colleagues that I know will give me good advice, that have been role models for me. A lot of times thinking about, well, how would so-and-so have dealt with this? And I think that's very helpful, is to do some visioning and kind of think about what would I have done, in a similar situation before, and then what would somebody I admire or consider a role model do. Both of those are helpful to me.
Nancy Schlossberg, what about you?
Well, when I was at Wayne State University, I was the chair of one of the first women's commissions in the country. And we were looking at women's staff and faculty. And we identified TIAA-CREF as a problem. At that time, they gave more money to men than to women. We actually initiated a lawsuit, and things have changed at TIAA-CREF. But TIAA-CREF was my issue. I then moved to the American Council on Education, and I was quite naive. I was in my mid-40s, and I was used to being in an academic environment where you could say what you wanted. But I was very naive. I didn't know what it was like to work for an organization like ACA, all of the different ones. But here I was, I'm at a meeting, and it not at the American Council, but in Washington in general with people from all kinds of associations. And the issue of TIAA-CREF came up, and I said, I'm speaking as an individual. And I went and spoke about my views on TIAA-CREF. The next day, I learned that Greenhow, I think his name was Greenhow at that time, the president of TIAA-CREF, heard about it, flew down to Washington, came to ACE, got Roger Hines, who was the president of ACE, said, what is this woman saying about TIAA-CREF? Don't you have any control over her? So I heard that they had this big meeting, and I went into Roger's office and I said, I heard that somebody from TIAA-CREF was in town. Shouldn't I have been at the meeting?
Yes.
And he said, you should have. And I apologized, but we arranged the meeting in the men's room. I said, Roger, I don't believe what I'm hearing. I absolutely don't believe it. Well, P.S., I realized at that moment I was not cut out for association work. I belonged on a faculty where I could speak and fight for what I believed in. Well, of course, I continued the year, and by the time I left, I really had established a nice relationship with people. But when a job opening came at the University of Maryland for a visiting professorship, not even a full professorship, with my husband, I decided, why should I stay in a situation where I really don't fit? I'm not cut out for it. And so I left ACE, and it's the only time I've left a job in less than 20 years practically, I stay in jobs a long time, 27 years at Maryland or 26. And I left not in anger, but in realizing I was young, I was naive, and it wasn't a good fit. So in a way, that's how I handled that situation. And I want to say, I made the biggest mistake of my life. So when I went to Maryland, I chose the state system instead of TIAA-CREF. I would have been financially much better off had I done it the other way. But I was young and I was principled and I blah, blah. So.
Well, I mean, yes, that inspiration led you to saying, you know, I have my values and I know what's important to me and this is important to me. Absolutely. Patty Perillo.
Nancy, I think about how those issues that you just talked about still remain. I just had a farewell party here at Virginia Tech this week, and many of my colleagues spoke about me, and one of the things, the common theme in all that they said was that she is a strong advocate and she persists. Because I challenge like you challenge, I confront like you confront, I raise the question, and so that still exists. And I've chosen administration, which makes that a little bit more complex, but there's a lot of work to be done in higher education. And so as you were telling the story, it made me think a little bit more about how it is that I respond to Vernon's question about how is it that during complex times I stay the course. And I think for me, as a first generation college student who really has never forgotten issues of class, I'm keenly aware that the college environment is a highly privileged one, that 30% today, that 30% of people get to go to college in the United States, 30% go to college. In the world, it's 7%. And in a place like Virginia Tech or a place like University of Maryland, it is 1%. And so when things get complex and complicated and hard, and they do, I don't lose perspective. It's like what Marcia Baxter McGolder talks about as being on the balcony and looking down. I hold tight and close to that perspective that, that we are fortunate to have an opportunity to learn and to educate. And I believe that education is the transformative possibility that creates the greatest hope for our future. So I don't take this work lightly, but I also know that even when things are really complex, they could be way worse. And I just never lose sight of that. And so I think that that grounds me. Certainly some of the things that my colleagues talked about, sharing with ACPA colleagues or sharing with my spouse, with my family, those things matter a lot too. But I think it's maintaining the perspective that, and never forgetting my purpose and my why that keeps me grounded.
Thank you. As you're talking about the purpose and the why, I'm thinking about future generations of higher education professionals. Would love to hear from you all around, what would be something that you would share to future generations as we move into toward the 100th anniversary of ACPA and new professionals who are coming into our field? What is something, just a nugget that you would share with folks? And I don't know, maybe Nancy Evans first.
What would I tell new or future leaders? I think don't forget the history.
Yes.
Don't forget the people that have come before you, and the work that they have done, and the reasons they make the decisions they made. I think when we teach history, we teach this happened, this happened, this happened. And we forget the why did that happen? Why did they make that particular decision that now seems strange? What were they thinking? I think it's really important to go back and look at that and to keep it in mind that these are wise people that preceded us, and that we are where we are because of the hard work that they did. And they took things as far as they could. And now, because the situation is different and maybe more complex and more, there are more resources available in some instances, the future leaders can take it further. But not to forget the groundwork that's already been laid.
Vernon, can I jump in there? Because I really want to underscore what Nancy's saying. It reminds me, this past weekend we had a board meeting, and the chair of our board committee is an African-American woman who was here on campus 35 years ago. And one of the student reps, who is a white male who was being a really great ally, was pressing for really important changes around issues of diversity and inclusion. And the board chair stepped in and said, I just want to remind you, because I think it's really important to name this here, that often students want to see the changes that they want made in 2 years or 3 years or 4 years. And she said, I tell you, I sit at this table right now, 30 plus years later, and this is a fundamentally different institution than when I was a student here. In fact, I never even imagined we would be the institution that we are right now. So the call to social justice is a long arc, and we have to stay focused on the long. And so she said it's really important for us to pay attention to our history, and that really has stayed with me. So I agree with you very much, Nancy, that I do think actually that people coming into college too don't have a great sense of the history. And so right. While the recommendation would be to hold tight to the history, it would also be to learn the history because it's really, really important.
Well, and I think about working with the ACPA governing board and watching folks who are newer professionals come into our profession and into ACPA, and it's that both and. It's like how far we've come and how far we have to go.
Yes.
Helping people hold both of those, because a lot of times we only focus on one or the other, I found. So.
I agree with you, Vernon.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. Nancy Schlossberg, what you got?
Well, I was just thinking how really lucky I was, not just to have Esther Lloyd Jones as a mentor, but to have worked with Art Chickering. And the work we did, we wrote 2 books together, but one, a Josie Bass book, Improving Higher Education for Adult Learners. So what we were doing and what Art encouraged me to think about is how we can apply academic knowledge to making the world better for students. So we looked at what was going on with students as they moved into an institution, through it and out, and then with the corresponding programs. Like, you have a lot of student personnel programs, but all of them aren't relevant for each phase of the student's life. They need different things when they're entering, different to hold them there, and different as they were leaving. I felt that with arts leadership, I really learned to apply academic knowledge to the needs of students. And so I credit him and feel I was very fortunate. And we did two things. We wrote the book for professionals to think about student services in terms of where the students were in the process of their education. We also wrote a book for students as they moved in, through, and out. So working with him on those two books convinced me of the importance of applying the knowledge we have in psychology and sociology to student affairs.
Yeah.
With young professionals, I can remember a conversation with somebody who had just going through a whole list of all the things that were wrong. This needed to be done different. This was wrong. This was wrong. This was wrong. And I agreed with him, actually, and there was no problem there. But I tried to say, pick one, pick something to start with. I think so often people get this picture of how much has to be done and how overwhelming it is. And it's the old Swiss cheese idea. You've got to pick a place to start. You've got to do the first thing or the second thing. And I think people get discouraged if they look at it as a whole, and it's how much more we need to move the needle than the little bit that we have. And so I think once I did that with that young man, he did that and he made a real difference about something. He took that thing and he was able institutionally to help make a change. And I think that's an important lesson to use all of the time, because it is so easy to get discouraged if you look at that kind of whole mess or even watch television the last couple of days. But anyway.
Well, Pat, as you're talking, I'm thinking about this whole piece around change management. Are there other things that you would share around transition and change management and how to engage others in terms of times when change needs to happen? Are there other things that you want to share about that?
I think I've seen it from a lot of different viewing points. Sometimes I needed to make change. I kind of felt in a very large organization, I had about 600 people, that every 10 years we should reinvent ourselves. And so we went through a change process intentionally in that way. And there's other times when you see a problem, and one way I've influenced an institution is by example. We in our area did a principles of community, where we said, here's what we believe, here's how we'll treat students. We had every person who wanted to, I think there were 2 or 3 out of 600 who didn't, sign that principles of community and mount it in our lobby so that every student could see it. And it talked about how we would be treating everybody regardless of gender or orientation or race or culture. And what that did when you do something like that is at some point, the institution as a whole picked it up and did it. And I thought, that's a way. And I needed to help make that work back out. I needed to let more diverse people take it over. So that was another way to do institutional change. And the third way that happens more often than people say, I think, is sometimes it's not the right time. Sometimes you just have to wait or back off for a little bit. And at some other point in time, maybe there would be more reception for an idea of change. Those are just a few examples of some of the things I was involved in. Now, it's 18 years since I've been on a campus, so I don't know that I'd take that advice being the same right now, but that's what I did.
I have a question for you, Pat. I love what you had to say,
Me too.
but you said at the beginning that every 10 years people need to reinvent themselves and that you've done that. Could you just say another sentence about that?
Sure, it doesn't mean that everything changes. It means that we take a critical look at what we're doing for our students. I believe in a change process that information's important. So part of how we would start these processes is try to get ourselves up to date on any research or best practices. And I would involve everybody in the entire process, of course. And we would go through that and look at, have our student population changed in that time? All kinds of things like that. And then we would pick a couple things and we would see what we could do to get from here to there in changing our organization. So in reinventing ourselves, I don't mean that 100% of it is, but that you sometimes can get kind of sleepy. You can get kind of just, oh, we're doing everything well. And we are doing everything well. I was not being critical of my staff in this process. But sometimes you need to step back a couple steps and bring in the new stuff and look at yourself critically.
Yeah, I love
Could
that.
I respond?
Okay.
Sure.
Just to some of the things that Pat said spurred a couple ideas for me. As a faculty member, I think I often I don't want to use the word used, but students were often the people that became change agents, and I was more the encourager. Where I can think of, Pat mentioned of principles of community. And I can remember a time when I had a student who was Latino, and he was just really upset about some of the things that were going on campus and how people were treating each other, and really wanted to do something. And I encouraged him to think about what that would look like and what would help that situation. And I sent him to a couple other people that I knew were good creative thinkers that would support him. And so why don't you talk to her about that? Why don't you talk to him about that? Well, in the end, he ended up leading the initiative to develop principles of community on Iowa State's campus that are still in effect and that are being used very effectively to help guide decision-making and help to handle conflict situations we're currently having. And every time I hear about the principles of community, I think of that student. And I feel really proud of that work that he did. That was one thing. I think faculty really have a role in encouraging and leading and guiding to create change. And the second thing that came to my mind was the idea of the right time. When I went to Iowa State, they had a decent curriculum. It needed work, but I wasn't going to be, coming in the first day and saying, we need to change this curriculum. And the longer that I was there with the same people, the more I really felt like we need to get a more social justice infused program going here. But I was really the only person that even knew what social justice was. So it really took until we got a couple new faculty, and the 2 or 3 of us all felt the same way, that we could start, talking about it and developing the concentration that we now have. So I really think it is important to think about the timing, and you can jump in too fast to situations and it ends up being a disaster. I had done that before in another institution.
We've learned the hard way, haven't we?
We learned the hard way. Yeah, no, let's not do that again. So.
One of my favorite Nancy Evans quotes is in a meeting one time. She said, just because you have one course on social justice and an adjunct faculty member does not mean that you're a social justice program. And I went, oh my goodness, Nancy. Wow, right to the point. Yes. Patty Perillo, what you got?
So I agree with everything my colleague said. Nancy, I agree with all that you said. What I'd like to add to this, just to be additive, is that like you, I've been through many changes. Like you, I've led many changes. Like you, many of those changes were externally defined. You had to respond to a change. And certainly many were internally defined, not just by myself, but with my colleagues. I really do think that leadership is constantly paying attention to what's happening within you and around you at all times. And as you continue to do that, you have a sense of when it's right to create the change that needs to happen. But what I would say is that I think that institutions of higher learning and divisions of student affairs tend to forget a really important element in a change process. I think often there's strategic thinking. I think often there's strategic planning. I think often there's organizational change processes and models where there's metrics and goals. But I don't think we pay attention to what's happening to individuals in transition processes. That what I've learned, if anything, is that even when others are deeply invested in the change, there's resistance, and not because they don't value or want the change, it's just because people aren't paying attention to what's happening to them in the change process. It's a lot of what Nancy Schlossberg talks about, and Bill Bridges. I love Bill Bridges' work around transition management. And so I've been a student of that work, and I pay attention to it. And as a vice president on a college campus now, and a large institution like Virginia Tech and University of Maryland's one as well, that I will continue to carry with me the commitment to pay attention to the psychological reorientation that happens to people in the change process, and care for them and tend to that in that process, which I think is really important. And I think it's a real missing element in change processes for people.
Good.
I need to, if I may, add something I hadn't thought about until I heard all of you talking, and especially Nancy Evans when she talked about the role of the student. Jane Goodman, I'm sure all of you know Jane, was a doctoral student. I was her advisor. Jane came to me, this is in the 60s, and said, Nancy, the strong vocational interest inventory is biased. You need to do something about it. She said, maybe we should look at legal action, but our husbands were both lawyers, and they said, it's not right to go the legal way. Go through the association. Now, I think this was before ACPA was an independent of the American Counseling. So Jane and I did research on the norm groups. So in the old strong, you would come out a nurse if you were a woman and a doctor if you were a man. And the rationale was there weren't enough people to have an effective norm group. Well, with Jane's pushing me, we did the research, and we found out that in most of these groups, there were enough people. You could have a norm group. You could change that. At any rate, I will never forget when we brought it before, what was it called? I don't remember the name of the overall association then, because it's had several name changes. The day that we brought it before, I was so nervous, and I don't get nervous. I mean, I was really frightened. These important people out there, and here we were trying to change something sacred. And in fact, one of our leaders, I won't mention his name, pointed his finger at me and he said, "What are you trying to do?" And so anyway, it all changed. And that was from a student, and she was the lead in that. Many years later, the man who really was in charge of the strong, not the originator, but the one, and I can't think of his name now. Can any of you think of it? Roger, strange, I can't remember his name. Anyway, he and I were on a program, and they asked us if, after we each gave our speech, would we look back at that history when I was opposing the work that he was doing. And he said, "Why didn't you just call me on the phone, Nancy?" And I said, if I, Nancy Schlossberg, and as assistant, I don't know if I was assistant or associate professor, somebody you'd never heard of, called you on the phone to raise questions about the struggle. Oh, Campbell. His name was Campbell. Do you think that would have resolved everything? Well, the audience broke out into, gales of laughter. But that was really, the change came about because of a student's leadership, a faculty member's responsiveness, and the times were right for it. Right. The historic time was right for it. So it did change, and I think it was a wonderful thing that happened.
Well, and Nancy, as you share your story, I'm thinking about the fact that you all have shared things in terms of being in places and making decisions that may not have been something that people would resonate to. And I just would love to hear a little bit more about how do you deal with, criticisms and critiques as you continue to do great work? How do you manage that? And Nancy Schlossberg, you go first, go.
I do want to respond to that. When I was at the American Council on Education, trying to move women to become college presidents, if I had ever wanted to be a college president, that was the time. And then when I went to Maryland, the deanship was open a number of times and the department chair. And I, by this time, knew myself well enough to know that I don't mind confrontation, but I don't like hostility. And that I didn't want to be in a role where, with decreasing resources, where I'd be having to say no and confront. And I chose, it wasn't quite as clear cut as I'm making it, but I chose to go the academic route then. That was a choice point. I could go administratively to college presidents, and I remember thinking, well, if I got a job as a college president, it would be fun to have my picture in the paper, and 3 days I would enjoy myself, and then I would be miserable. I can deal with anxiety. I don't deal well with hostility.
Nancy Evans, what about you?
Yeah, Nancy Schlossberg, that was great, because I think I'm the same. I don't deal with conflict well, as anyone who knows me will tell you. I get very upset. I take things personally. I cry a lot. And I am not, I can do the work of administration. I think I do that very well. I think I'm a good leader. I think I I have reasonably good ideas, and I'm very good at carrying things out. What I'm not good at is dealing with all the politics and all of the conflict and all of the stuff that comes with it. Many people asked me over the years if I was going to become department chair, dean, or whatever. I said, absolutely not. That is not my strength. Cannot deal with that. And I think I really learned that from being ACPA president, because to be very honest, it was a miserable year. It was a terrible year for me. The only thing that I bring out of that experience was a wonderful conference. Thank you, Vernon, and very good colleagues. And I but personally, it took a mental toll, it took a physical toll that I think I still am dealing with. So I knew, no, I'm not cut out for that kind of work, and I just need to acknowledge that.
I think it's an interesting thing. Either you choose to make a switch or you don't. And I think sometimes it's good not to. And other times people make the switch in terms of getting a different position, but they don't make the switch in terms of the skills they're bringing to it, or their viewpoint, or things like that. Because I have made errors when I have tried to hire some people who were very good at what they did, but that is not necessarily the same as being very good at going to another level. I think I ended up thinking that I'm doing this for students, and if I always remember that, it won't be so hard what I'm going through. And I also found that where I put most of my effort was in mentoring young professionals. And if I mentored those young professionals and they were healthy and happy, the students would be taken care of. So it's kind of a two-step process when you get up higher in a chain in an organization. You're doing things maybe for the students, not maybe, certainly. And you always have to have that in mind, but you're not necessarily doing it directly with the students. You are trying to have a staff who is healthy, well-trained, has professional support to learn new things, and then they will do a whole lot with students. And some people can't make that transition. They love to work directly with students. Bless them, we need them. But they are given some other roles and they don't do them as well because there had been one study, I can't remember where I read it, too many years have gone by, that how much time a dean of students or a vice president for student affairs spends with staff and how much they spend directly with students. And some of the more successful ones did spend time with students. You never give that up. But they didn't spend the majority of their time with their students. They tried to spend it in terms of taking care of their organization and their people. So that's how I did that. And exactly what you said. Sometimes people say awful things to you. You have to keep in mind why you're doing it, or you wouldn't do it. Very much so. And also, after a little time, think about it, because sometimes there's some true nuggets in there that you need to pay attention to. You know, criticism can be good.
Absolutely.
Sometimes it's not delivered in a way that makes you want to listen, but sometimes it can be good.
Patty Perillo.
You all are making me think about so many things. So one of the things that I want to begin with is that I'm just reminded that I'm on a panel of women. And I think that your reflective responses, I think, do illustrate this gender dynamic that often happens in leadership. The fact that you've spent a lot of time thinking about, do my gifts, do my talents, do my personal characteristics meet the needs of the next position, yes or no, and you make choices based on that. Recently, Susan Comavez and John Dugan and some others have done some research on college student leadership development. And they asked college women, and this is just in the last couple of years, college women, do you have the competencies for a job? Yes. Would you apply for it? No, I'm not ready yet. They asked college men, do you have the competencies for the job? No. Will you apply? Yes, I will. And so that research has encouraged me to bring onto this campus a women's leadership development experience to have women think about those things. But I heard that in all of what you said, when I know that many of our male counterparts don't necessarily think of those things. Not all, but some don't have to think about those things in the ways that we think about it. I even think about this past week at my farewell party when a constant theme was she persists and she advocates. there was a gender dynamic in that comment too. I know that for sure. And so like you all, I don't like conflict. I don't like it at all. But what I think perhaps being one of 8 children, I learned pretty early on that if you navigate the conflict, the whole will become far greater than it was before the conflict. And so I do have a way of moving through conflict always with others. I think it's just part of my natural DNA as one of 8 kids, always with others. And so, like you said, Pat, I think that sometimes critique and criticism, sometimes, maybe all the time, I try to find ways to welcome that kind of feedback, because all of us as leaders have areas that we cannot see. You know, we've got certain biases and ways of being. And so I do welcome that feedback. How it's done does matter. There's no doubt about that. And I would also say that I don't feel like I've hit lots of criticism, although I've challenged systems and I've made lots of change, because I often do it with others. And so anything that I'm doing is done in a way where there's lots of qualitative, quality conversations along the way with my leadership team, with the next level, with students. So there's a whole lot of work that I do before I create the change. And again, I want to go back to a gender dynamic. I've watched some of my male counterparts just make changes like that without all of the work on the front end, and it's fine. I do all this work on this front end, I make the change, and there's criticism. And I wouldn't do it any other way. I wouldn't do it any other way. And so, anyway, that's what I would say. I'd say that I welcome it as long as it's done with the intention of making me and the process or the program better. But if it's coming from a mean-spirited critique, I don't own that. I'm really clear about that.
Well, as we're sort of moving toward the end of our time together, I'm going to do 2 more questions. The first one is around legacy. I just want you to reflect a little bit on your legacy. I mean, what would you want folks to be saying about you and your contributions to the profession, student affairs, higher education, ACPA, whatever it is? Talk a little bit about your legacy. I want you to brag a little bit, which I don't think that you all get to do enough. Talk about your legacy. And let's start with Nancy Schlossberg.
That's an interesting question. And I really, for some reason, haven't thought a lot about that. But I think the thing that has driven me, there are 2 themes. One is fighting bias. And I did early studies on that, on counselor bias, on people's bias, and most recently, implicit bias. I'm very concerned about bias and the fact that all of us are biased. We really are. If we had time, I would tell you the proof that I am. Well, I will tell you. I went to a party one night and there was a convertible with 4 people in it. And I thought, great, it's an intergenerational party. 4 people from a retirement home got out of that car. And I thought, here, with all of my work on aging, with myself being old, I would have sworn I don't have bias. Clearly, I have a bias. And that was, to me, a great lesson. But the legacy, the thing that has driven me since my early, not from the very beginning, but my interest in taking what we know about adult learners, about adults in general, and developing programs and practices that enhance people, that keep people aware of options. The thing I miss most in retirement is that when I worked at an institution, I was in a position to help people realize their dreams. Somebody would say, you know, I'm in your program, but I wish I were doing something else. And I could strategize with that person how to make what they want happen. I love that part of my work. I do miss that. The academic, I've been able to keep writing, but it's the translation that I'm able to translate academic work into very very applied work. And in retirement, I did write a book. I've written several books, actually. My retirement has been writing books based on the work I did as an academic, but writing it for people. They're $20 books published by the American Psychological Association and a few other places. But when I realized my passion, for the last book I wrote, I sent a proposal to a major company, and they wrote back with a contract. And they said, but it has to be more academic and it has to be longer. And I remember thinking, if I don't sign this contract, I might never get a contract for a number of reasons. I'm not in a position to sell the kind of books. I'm not in a setting where books are just automatically going to sell. So if I say no, that means I probably will never write the book I want to write, my last book. I said no, and I explained that my passion now is translating things that I've learned that might be of help to people, especially older people. And that's what I'm passionate about. Whether it's a legacy, I don't know. I have loved my career. I really have. I've loved being part of this association, the other associations that are trying to help learners be more effective. It's been, for me, just fabulous. And that I had a husband who was so supportive of my working and made it possible for me to have the life I've had. And all of the colleagues I've worked with, I'm just so grateful. And I feel very honored that I have had the opportunities I've had. And that's it.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
Thanks, Nancy. What about you, Pat?
Well, in a very selfish way and somewhat similar to what Nancy said, I think the thing that gives me the most personal pleasure are the young men and women who I touch their lives a little bit, both students, and sometimes you get letters from them and say, you know, you've made a difference in their life. And that might be once every 5 or 10 years, but still, that's why you live. But more the professionals, and to know that they're all across the country in all kinds of very responsible jobs, vice presidents, presidents, deans. I think that gives me the most personal pleasure. You know, and there were a lot of things that happened around diversity. And at the time I was the ACPA president, they were not in good financial shape, and I left them in very good financial shape. One of my minors was business, and so I feel very good about that worked out well. And also that I moved a little bit in, and I still think there's so much to be done, that we have to come to terms with working with the academic side of our institutions if we're going to survive. I don't think we can stand alone. I think those are the things that hit me the most to that question.
Nancy Evans?
As a faculty member, we are judged on the basis of our teaching, our scholarship, and our service. And currently, I think they say that, but really what you're judged on is your scholarship, and particularly, can you get money? And I am glad that my career is over in regard to how faculty are evaluated, because I don't fit that mold very well. I took seriously, you know, I have a 3-pronged career. I have a career as a teacher, I have a career as a scholar, and I have a career in in providing service to my profession. And I think as I look at my resume, it's balanced. I can't say really that I would, meet the highest level on any one thing, but if you put it together, I think it's a pretty darn good record. And I'm proud of the work that my students do. I am incredibly proud, and they are really my legacy. And I have been blessed to have incredible students who have been motivated to do wonderful things. And, one of them is leading this panel. I am also, I think I have left a legacy in terms of my scholarship. I was one of the writers of the first student development book. I was one of the writers of the first book on lesbian, gay, and bisexual issues on campus. And I was a writer of the first book on disability services on campus. And I think those books make a difference to the field and will continue to do that, mostly by the work that follows them. But the first, there always has to be a first person, and I have been that first person in those areas, and I'm very proud of that. And then service. I think I have done, most of my service has been in ACPA, almost all of it. And I love the association, and I think I'm well regarded in ACPA as having been somebody that has helped the association in a number of different ways. So I think, that those would be things that I would point to.
Patty Perillo.
I'm just going to say, what a really sweet moment, Nancy, for you to talk about legacies that you hope are in your students. And Vernon Wall is right here as one of your students. That was very poignant. And I'd like to say to each one of you, Pat and Nancy, that I know that you have legacies because I am a better scholar practitioner because of the work that you have done and the work that you laid before me as I still work on a college campus. And so, like you all, I don't know if I think as much about legacies as much as I think about what is important for me when all is said and done in my work. And I think that what's most important for me is that I've left every place better than I found it. And that was always done by leading with love. And I think that we live in a world that tells people to keep that away from the workplace. And what I know in no uncertain terms is that young people, particularly not even young people, but certainly that developmental passage, that sense of belonging is great then as any time in our lives, but all of us are wired for connection and need a sense of belonging. And I think it's really important to lead with love. And so I am a head and heart and soul connected leader. And my hope is that I leave every place better than I found it. That I hope that I am experienced as a courageous leader, that I use my position of privilege and power to speak up and stand up for those in the margins, not just for personal gain or not even for personal gain, but that I use it to make a difference. And everywhere I've been, I set up interfaith centers or cultural centers or first generation centers. And I'd say the third thing that I hope is that I feel very strongly, given the many blessings in my life, that once you cross the line, you have a responsibility to pull others across that line. And so as a first generation college student myself, I've done all kinds of work to create greater access and success and retention for first gen students. And as somebody who has their doctorate, which I still find hard to believe, given my life journey, that I do a whole lot of work to champion and care for and support those who are crossing that line too. Hello.
Thank you all. Just want to wrap up with just a question around your wish for ACPA in higher education. What is something that you want to share that is your wish as you think about your trajectory, your lifetime in the profession? What's a wish that you have? And any closing thoughts that you have as we wrap up. So Let's start with Nancy Evans.
For ACPA, I wish for a strong, financially secure association that is able to lead the way on diversity and inclusion and all things around social justice. I think the direction that we're moving is important and appropriate. It sets us apart from other organizations, and it's challenging and it's scary. And I think that's where ACPA shines, is when we're doing things that are challenging and scary. And so I hope and I believe that we are now in a position where we can move ahead as opposed to fixing things. We are always fixing things. And I really believe that we are going to change that with the current leadership. And that's what I hope. For higher education, I really, really hope that higher education can find ways to serve all students, not just privileged students, but all students, first-gen students, students from different minoritized groups, disabled students, adult students, everybody. Because I agree with Patty. I think education is the way that we are going to change the world. There's no other way. And higher education has a responsibility to ensure that this country and this world continue to move in positive directions, and directions where we can all work together for global understanding and positive impact on all people.
Thanks, Nancy. Nancy Schlossberg, what about you?
I guess I'm hoping that income inequality starts disappearing instead of getting worse.
Yes.
I'm hoping that climate change will be addressed. And I think that it's the college students and the young people who can really move us ahead on those things. And I'm hoping that higher education and education in general will be a vehicle for making this world really better than it is now. So that's what I'm hoping. And thank you, Vernon, for today, and Chris for making this happen.
Pat, do you want to share your response?
Well, I think I was thinking along the same line, but in my way, in a more pragmatic way that Nancy did, which is the cost of any higher education now. I've come to really appreciate community colleges because I've been involved with them since I've retired. And I think I worry a great deal about the financial aid situation and its lack of ability to help students who aren't privileged and aren't rich. And I don't think financial aid that leaves people 20 and 30 and 50 and more thousands of dollars in debt is really a good thing to do to students, particularly if they're not in one of the STEM areas. So my hope is that the world can look more broadly and kindly on students who go into technical careers. Not everybody needs to go to a research university or go into a four-year school. And I'd like to see ACPA broaden that a little bit. I think so many of us who are involved, myself included, have come through large four-year institutions. I was at Michigan State, Indiana. I worked on my doctorate at Oregon State, and I worked in every other time in a large institution except one. I tried at a small one once, and that was not for me. So that's my hope, that we can try to help students not get so far in debt that the rest of their life is spent paying off the debt.
I agree with all of my colleagues for sure. And what I would add is that ACPA has always been my professional home because it's been the leader, I think, in two things primarily. Its call and commitment to social justice education and its scholarship. I mean, it is the best home for student affairs scholarship than any other profession in any other association in higher education. And so given that, my hope is that ACPA continues to capitalize on its strengths. And I think it's living into that, there's no doubt, in its call for social justice and social justice action and social justice education. I think that it's happening because I believe that we have to make this world more humane and just. And I think that this next generation of young people, one of the things that I love about this generation is that they demand equality. They just demand it. And I think that it's that ACPA and education meeting this next generation can create a more humane and just world. And what I also hope for the profession is that we continue as practitioners to learn from our scholarship. I mean, there's no doubt that we need more scholar practitioners. And I think that's really, really important because I think that's where the change happens. When you use the scholarship to inform your practice, and that's what creates the transformation. And I think that ACPA being the home place for the scholarship of our profession has an opportunity to transform institutions of higher learning as people continue to move that scholarship into practice.
I just want to make sure that I give extreme gratitude to all of you for joining me and having this conversation. I want to say, on behalf of ACPA and the profession, thank you. I hope that you know that you have enriched so many lives, and you will continue to do that through the things that you continue to do. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for your contributions, and have a good rest of the day.